Hello everyone, this is Here's Trivia, and today we're concluding the founding of Jin Let's Talk Lore series with episode 8 titled Ending the Rebellion. Before we get started, here's the answer to our trivia question from the end of our last episode. Now, last time we covered how the Qin Rebellion started out as a minor regional resistance against the oppression of the Jin policies and the racial tension between the resettled nomadic tribes and the local Han population. Then, as the initial rebellion saw success against the Jin forces with the death of 3 Jin prefects in Hulie, Su Yu, and Qianhong, more and more joined in, as the degree of nomadic oppression in the northwest was quite the systematic issue for all the various nomadic tribes and even portions of the lower class Han population that would also eventually join the rebellion as well. With few established officials willing to risk their neck to turn the situation around, the rebellion was allowed to linger on for 7 long years as the Jin side dug in under the guidance of Prince of Ruyin, Sima Jun, who took over command of the northwest after his older brother Sima Liang was relieved of his duties there. During this period, the Jin forces in the northwest were able to recover and build a foundation of ample supplies and well-drilled troops, as they kept the rebellion contained until the moment was right for the counterattack. And that moment would finally arrive in March of 277, when the Jin imperial court sent General Wen Yang to take command of the long-awaited counteroffensive against the rebels. Taking over the troops that Sima Jun had recruited and trained, Wen Yang launched a 3-front offensive that took place simultaneously in the provinces of Liang, Yong, and Qin, and in one fell swoop, the rebels were caught off guard and beaten back across all fronts as years of little Jin response had made them grow weak and comfortable. After taking heavy losses, Tufa Shujineng and an assembly of 20 chieftains representing the various nomadic tribes that made up the coalition of rebels, decided that organizing a counterattack against the sudden Jin offensive would be too difficult, given that March was just the start of spring, and all their horses were at their weakest state after surviving through the winter on just dried hay. So to buy themselves some more time, they offered the Jin court a surrender term, as each of them was willing to part with one of their sons as a political hostage to the Jin court in order to return to peace with the Jin dynasty. As military operations in the northwest was always an expensive endeavor, the Jin court happily accepted these terms as over 200,000 rebels quote-unquote surrendered to the Jin in spring of 277. Yet these hostage sons would come to mean very little to the nomads as this mirage of peace shattered in 278. After plotting and preparing for over a year, Tufa Shujineng broke the peace terms as the commandery of Wei was raided and attacked out of the blue. Yang Xin, the new prefect of the Liang province, would be killed, as he would become now the 4th prefect killed by the rebels. Just a year later, the entire Liang province fell under Tufa Shujineng's control, as the enraged Jin emperor Sima Yan demanded for solutions from his imperial court. Now, much like the Han dynasty in the past, there were a sizable portion of court officials that believed holding on to the frontier provinces such as the Liang province was simply too expensive, especially during times of nomadic uprising. And given that the kingdom of Wu was still an unfinished business in the south, most of these officials argued that the Liang province should be just abandoned in the meantime and given over to these rebels. But others in court argued against this idea on the grounds that territory must never be ceded. Emperor Sima Yan also agreed with this assessment and asked his generals if any of them were up to the task to recapture the Liang province. As most of the high-ranking generals stood in silence, a minor officer by the name of Ma Long spoke up and volunteered himself for the task, as he claimed that all he would need is a small elite force of around 3,000 of Jin's best warriors to recover the province. At the time, Ma Long was just a Sima Du, which is a military rank that ranks in the 6th tier out of a total of 9. So it was quite low, and not even exactly what you would even call a mid-tier officer. Before this point, the only historically notable thing Ma Long has done was burying his old master, Ling Huyu, after the failed first rebellion of Huainan. This was notable because Ling Huyu was a co-conspirator in the rebellion, so no one dared to give him a proper burial after his death. As Ma Long was a house guest of Ling Huyu, he ended up giving Ling Huyu a burial, even though it could have very well costed him his life. Fortunately for him, Sima Yi and the Wei court ignored Ma Long's transgressions at the time, as he would end up gaining quite a bit of a local fame as a brave and loyal individual. With this reputation in place, Ma Long was eventually recommended to join the army, where he would rise to his current minor officer position. Delighted that someone was willing to volunteer for this tall task, Emperor Sima Yan happily accepted Ma Long as the new commander in charge of recapturing the Liang province. Sima Yan also approved Ma Long's request for 3,000 of Jin's best troops, as he would allow Ma Long to host his own qualification exam for the troops of the Jin Central Army in order to select these 3,000. While 3,000 is a very small number of troops, the reason behind this was not because Ma Long was boasting or trying to outbid someone else for the task, but rather he had to keep the troop count low in order to get approval from the rest of the imperial court, as the main argument against taking military action centered around the high cost. Thus, with fewer troops, you would need fewer supplies. Now, the qualification requirements laid out by Ma Long were quite straightforward. First, you have to be able to reload and pull a heavy crossbow. During the Jin Dynasty, heavy crossbows had a 238 kilogram or roughly 525 poundage of force. Second, you had to be able to draw a 26 kilogram or almost 60 poundage bow. For reference, modern-day Olympic recurve bows are limited to a maximum of 60 poundage, with most male participants averaging only around 48.5 poundage draws. So those who qualified for Ma Long's test were quite strong, and after just a half day of testing, 3,500 members of the Jin Central Army qualified, as Sima Yan would give all 3,500 troops to Ma Long, along with 3 years' worth of food and a laundry list of special requests made by Ma Long that included high-quality wooden staffs, magnetic rocks, and rhino hide armor. Officially, Ma Long was promoted to Taolu Hujun, or the lieutenant who attacks the rebels, and the administrator of Wu Wei, which was not a huge promotion, as he would not even get a general rank, but this was more or less due to the fact that his original position was just so low ranked. But regardless of what his rank would be, with these 3,500 elite units, Ma Long's small army would cross over the Wind River, east of Wu Wei, and enter into rebel territory. Now, the first thing Ma Long did was to construct a series of wooden siege cart that had removable roofs called pianxiangche, and the purpose of these siege cart was to protect their infantry army from cavalry charges out on the open plain, as these carts would be spaced out around them as obstacles to stop organized horse charges, while also offering protection and cover for the archers and crossbows inside to return fire on the nomadic horse archers during the battle. And when traveling through narrower valleys, the roofs with plenty of overhang can be installed to provide protection from arrows above. And after a few skirmishes against Ma Long and his siege carts, the Nomads under Tufa Shujineng started to take heavy losses as their cavalry advantage disappeared, especially as Ma Long's troop all could shoot from much greater distances than the nomadic horse archers due to their strength and heavier bows and crossbows. And this type of engagement continued as Ma Long's troop advanced deeper and deeper into the Liang province, striking fear into the various nomadic tribes. Now at this point, because of how far Ma Long's unit had advanced, his unit actually lost contact with the Jin Imperial Court, as many members of the court falsely believed that this small army must have perished and all died deep within rebel-controlled territory, But in reality, Ma Long's army was so successful that a small number of nomadic tribes were already flocking to surrender after becoming convinced that Ma Long was undefeatable. With no other options, Tufa Shujineng decided to organize one final counterattack as he gathered tens of thousands of rebels and ordered them to dismount and engage as infantry, hoping that they could just overwhelm Ma Long's army with sheer numbers. And thus, in December of 279, the two sides met in battle, as Ma Long was already prepared for such a situation, as the magnetic rocks that he had brought with him were scattered all around the battlefield. With his troop armored in rhino hide and using just wooden staffs, the magnetic stones had no impact on his army, while they created an uncomfortable and almost magical distraction to Tufa Shujineng and his rebel troops. So even though heavily outnumbered, Ma Long was able to not just win the battle, but also kill the rebel leader in Tufa Shujineng, who eventually died at hands of some of his former coalition allies who had turned on him after deciding to surrender to this seemingly invincible Jin side. And with Tufa Shujineng's death, his nephew, Tufa Wuwan, would eventually take over the Tufa tribe as he would represent the tribe and the coalition of rebels to formally surrender to the Jin, as the Qinliang Rebellion would be finally over after exactly a decade at the cost of tens of thousands of Jin troops and 4 prefects that included some experienced generals such as Hu Lie and Qian Hong. Now, by the time Ma Long finished his campaign and finally reestablished his contact with the Jin court, Emperor Sima Yan would be elated as all of a sudden the rebellion was over, especially when everyone at court believed that Ma Long and his troop had already met their end. Ma Long, the hero of the campaign, would eventually serve out his days as an administrator on the Western Front, and he would even leave behind a military scripture called Ba Zhen Zong Shu that covered the usage of siege cart formations for future generations to learn from. More importantly, with the peace finally restored in the northwest in late 279, Jin could finally turn its full attention on the kingdom of Wu, as an all-out 6-front attack against Wu would be launched in late 279, and just in a few months' time, by March of 280, the kingdom of Wu under Emperor Sun Hao would formally surrender, as the Three Kingdoms period would finally come to an end under a united Jin dynasty. But as the Qinliang Rebellion foreshadowed, the infighting between different factions within the Jin imperial court, an inheritance issue with the mentally challenged crown prince Sima Zhong, and a growing nomadic threat, especially in face of declining global temperature that would force nomads to roam farther and farther south, would all add up to make the Jin dynasty a rather short-lived one. But that would be a story for a different time and perhaps a different channel, as I do have plans to make a new channel in the future to cover all of Chinese history. In the meantime, our series here on the founding of the Jin is complete. For details on the final campaign that would bring down the kingdom of Wu, you will just have to wait for our eventual finale series of Let's Talk Lore. In the meantime, I'll be returning to some minor series, as our next series here will cover the life of Lu Meng, a rather talented and controversial Wu general, most famous for the killing of Guan Yu. So hopefully you all have enjoyed this episode and series enough to consider subscribing to the channel for more content on Three Kingdoms history, or simply support the channel by leaving a comment below, or just by hitting the like button. And as always, I'll see you all next time. Bye!